What are the remaining key problems identified by the Commission, Gail, in the emerging issue space, and has a clear case been made for regulatory intervention?
Well, the other emerging issues were to do with data ownership, interoperability, usability, and access to data. And I think, as recently announced with the review of the PSI directive, which is coming up in spring 2018, cross-links will be made to other relevant policy instruments, including the areas of access to and reuse of scientific information and geospatial information. And the review will also consider measures allowing public sector bodies of member states to access data held by private entities whenever it would considerably improve the functioning of the public sector, and particularly if the public sector has paid for it, it's subcontracted, if you like. And beyond publicly funded data and data of public interest, a culture of data sharing also needs to be encouraged in business-to-business context so that we can all benefit from the great potential of data as a resource. And this opens up almost infinite possibilities of building new products or services to improve processes. On the issues of safeguards, the challenge is then to facilitate data sharing while at the same time protecting, as Julia said, individuals' privacy, as well as strategic corporate assets, know-how, and intellectual and industrial property.
Julia.
Well, I think the area of access to data is a very important one where a lot still needs to be done. And I think it will not be possible to address these issues completely separate from questions of copyright or intellectual property rights in a broader sense. Just to start with the Public Sector Information Directive, for example, it encourages member states to have public sector information publicly licensed, but they're not actually required to do so. And even when we're talking not just about public sector information in the broader sense, official works, so information works that are created by the state, by ministries, we don't even have an obligation to make sure that this information is in the public domain. So we've had cases, for example...
You had a nice leaked report yesterday on copyright, which was hidden away for some time.
Well, yeah, that is one example.
Sorry,
but
it was misled for some time.
But to be clear, there the problem was not copyright. There the problem was that it was simply not published. But even when information is published, we had a famous case in Germany where somebody did a freedom of information request for a document from a ministry. The ministry sent it to him. They had to under the law, and then told him, don't put it online because that would violate the copyright of the lawyer, our in-house lawyer who wrote it. And I mean, that is just obviously misusing copyright as a censorship tool. And this should not be possible because works that are created by public officials in their public functions should not be covered by copyright in the first place. And I think we also need to address, if we want to address ownership, that we already have kind of a data producer's right in the area of databases, where we have the sui generis database right, which applies to databases that are not original creations. And the European Parliament has actually called for it to be abolished. So I hope that is going to happen and that is going to be part of the efforts in this area.
But if you're a government lawyer, are you going to give an expressed free opinion knowing that that's going to be interrogated and that you're going to be labelled with it?
Well, if you do not want this information to become public, then this is a question of how far should transparency laws reach. I personally am a big fan of transparency laws, but what does not work is saying, oh, actually we have a freedom of information law, we have a transparency law, you are allowed to see this document, but then you're not allowed to show it to anybody else because of copyright. I mean, that is absurd.
Yeah. Luukas, on the emerging issues, what's still on the table here?
Well, there's a lot on the table. One thing I'd highlight is this question of the technical aspects of how we actually might build this data economy. So open APIs, making a lot of the data exchange work. If you talk about how to do that in the private sector, you can have a very long discussion about voluntary models, market incentives versus regulation. But what is clear is that when we look at the data the public sector has, there you can be a bit more proactive. You can go in and say there need to be open APIs. You do need to make it possible to share data. And we're not just talking about, you know, open data. We can also be talking about data that isn't public, but that should be available in a structured manner, for instance, to the parties that have a legitimate reason to access it. So for instance, we have now currently something we're working on, the single digital gateway, which would take a number of data, not data sets, but sets of data that are relevant to how a business functions, its business licenses, its permissions, and let them export that in a machine-readable form and take it to another member state, have that member state accept the data as the official administrative document in a machine-readable form. So even as we have this discussion about what the right way to approach the broader data economy is, we should also work on creating some of the technical standards and specifications and infrastructure to make sure that as the market demand gets there, we also can actually implement it.
Okay. Guido, are there any pressing issues left?
No, I think we covered most of it. I mean, maybe very quickly, you know, about the emerging issues. Going back to what I said in the beginning, on the industry side, I think the fact of having the freedom to address these relationships through private agreements is really, really important. There doesn't seem to be a real urgent need to regulate this one way or the other. One thing we didn't touch upon is liability. Maybe, you know, that's a whole, you know, different set of issues. But one point is important. I think, you know, we are not talking about just one solution. We need to consider that there may be very different solutions depending on the area you're looking at.